I discovered my sister-in-law on a nanny cam telling my son that she was his real mom, but the worst part is that my husband was involved in this family madness. My husband, David, and I have been married for the past 8 years. We have a son together named Tom. He is currently 4 years old and a very playful child with a hyperactive imagination. Tom has always been very attached to me and is a bit of a mama's boy, which doesn't bother me at all because I know that as soon as he becomes a teenager, he will have his own interests and may not want to spend as much time with me. David and I are great partners, and over the years, we have perfected our routine in taking care of the house and Tom, while also maintaining fulfilling careers. Honestly, this harmony between us has been possible because I thought I had a very respectful and communicative husband, like David. So, you'd think I have nothing to complain about on Reddit, right? Well, today I am making this post about my husband's sister, Kathy. I don't want to start by showing my bias against her, but let's just say that Kathy is extremely difficult to get along with. She has always been cold toward me from the beginning, and this behavior has remained the same, even though David and I have been married for a long time. I remember that at the beginning of our relationship, David told me that his parents would easily approve of me, but that his sister Kathy would definitely interrogate me because she has always been very protective of him. Well, he was right. The first night we met her, she bombarded me with questions about my family, my childhood, and my siblings. No matter what I answered, she never seemed impressed and kept her nose up the whole time. She also brought up David's ex-girlfriends in the middle of our conversation and compared me to them as if it were the most normal thing in the world. At one point during dinner, she invited David to join her and her friends on a girls' trip, telling him that he needed to clear his mind before getting serious with someone. This statement made me very uncomfortable, and I was visibly upset, which David noticed and asked his sister to calm down in the most polite way possible. Now, this is something that sometimes bothers me about my husband. Although he stands up to his sister, he is not really firm with his boundaries because of his affection for her. I guess this makes her assume that she can keep pushing the issue because she is the older sister, and according to her, only she has his best interests at heart. Since that first dinner meeting, I was convinced that Kathy and I would not get along. It hurt me a little, but I wasn't going to try to convince someone to love and accept me if they had already made up their mind. Despite this incident, I was always polite to her whenever we met, but she never made it easy for me. One particular incident that comes to mind immediately is David's grandparents' anniversary party. They had invited the whole family, and I was invited as David's date since we had been dating for a year. During the party, family members approached me to engage in conversation, and I honestly loved how relaxed and friendly his family was. The only person who didn't say a word to me or acknowledge me was Kathy. I noticed this and kept my distance from her as much as possible. At one point, his grandparents asked everyone to gather for a group photo. While we were gathering, Kathy loudly pointed at me and told me to step out of the picture. David raised his eyebrows at her, while Kathy continued saying that maybe he would break up with me in the future, and that she didn't want one of her brother's bimbos to be part of this photo. My face turned red with embarrassment as everyone looked uncomfortable. David tried to argue, but Kathy kept talking over him, saying that I was just a stranger and shouldn't even have come to this event. I had heard enough and felt completely humiliated. David had attended many of my family's functions, and none of my relatives had ever treated him this way. I apologized and went back to the house to grab the car keys. I had no intention of spending another minute with that woman. David and his parents ran after me, trying to apologize. His mother tried to convince me to go back with them, but the moment had already been ruined. I could hear David's grandparents loudly reprimanding Kathy, and I felt even guiltier for ruining everyone's day. I left immediately, and that night I even considered breaking up with David because I knew I wouldn't be able to handle someone like his sister. However, it turned out that David came to my house with flowers and pastries to apologize. He told me that everyone had scolded Kathy for being rude to me, and that he had threatened to cut ties with her as well, which apparently made her cry. He told me he was fed up with his sister's antics and didn't want to have anything to do with her. We talked a lot, and I felt reassured that he had stood up for me. In the following days, David kept his word. We stopped seeing Kathy completely, and he stopped answering her calls. Sometimes she would show up at his house unannounced, so he changed all his locks and asked his parents to talk to her to respect his private space. His parents supported his decision, so Kathy had no choice but to accept that her brother didn't want anything to do with her. We thought this would make her reflect and regret the way she had treated me, but it turned out to have the opposite effect. She started calling and texting me, leaving threatening messages and blaming me for everything. The breaking point was when she showed up at my workplace one afternoon demanding to see me. Fortunately, my manager intervened and kicked her out, but I was truly shaken. I told David that at this point, I had no choice but to break up with him to get away from his crazy sister, file a complaint against her, and take her to court for harassing me. David started crying when he heard this, begging me that there was no reason to break up and pleading with me to give him a chance to fix it. Then he convinced his parents to organize a meeting between him and Kathy at their house, where they finally had their last conversation. His parents knew what she had been doing to me and made it very clear that they wanted nothing to do with her. David and his parents warned Kathy that her behavior was bordering on insanity and that if she continued, they would support my decision to take her to court. Somehow, Kathy finally broke down and admitted that she needed help. She told them how she was spiraling and didn't know how to stop. She also revealed that she had lost her job and had been unemployed for several months, which had affected her mental health. Fortunately for her, David's parents intervened and immediately had her admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where she could be closely monitored. David reiterated his desire not to have contact with her, which Kathy finally accepted. She sent me an apology message that, in my opinion, seemed a little insincere, but for her sake, I hoped she would heal. When David and I finally got married, we decided not to invite Kathy, even though she had been discharged and seemed to be doing well in her life. I wanted nothing to do with her, and everyone respected my wish. She sent me flowers congratulating me on my happy day, which I really appreciated. Right after we got married and returned from our honeymoon, Kathy announced that she was getting married. We were all surprised since no one knew she was dating anyone at the time, but at the same time, we were happy for her. However, we became concerned when we learned that she was dating a guy she had met during her time in the psychiatric hospital. To give you full context, this guy, James, was schizophrenic and an alcoholic with volatile tendencies, according to his doctors. Understandably, David and Kathy's parents were a bit worried when they found out. Kathy announced to everyone that her wedding would be next month and that she only wanted David to be there, not me. I expected this, and I was relieved that she hadn't invited me since it saved me the time of making up an excuse not to attend. However, my husband was offended that his sister only invited him and not me, so he didn't attend the wedding either. Those who did attend later told us that the event was a complete disaster. It turns out that Kathy and James were completely drunk during the ceremony and couldn't even repeat the words correctly after the priest. During the reception, James kept drinking and got so drunk that he started tearing off his shirt and pants while everyone watched in horror. Being schizophrenic, James didn't like being stared at and immediately attacked the event's waiter, who was just an innocent bystander, shouting that the waiter looked suspicious and was hiding something. James's family eventually calmed him down and convinced the waiter not to press charges by paying him off. However, this incident understandably left everyone worried, and we were all quite concerned for Kathy's safety. If James could attack a random stranger, what guarantee was there that he wouldn't attack her? David and his parents tried to privately talk to Kathy about her husband's strange behavior, but Kathy seemed convinced that she could change him and have a good life with him. No matter how much her parents tried to warn her about the red flags, she seemed certain that James would never hurt her. I wish I could say here that she was right, but as you can probably imagine, James treated her exactly as everyone had warned. Over the years, David and his parents tried to stay in touch with Kathy, but James deliberately cut off her contact with everyone and prevented her from speaking to anyone. We couldn't file a case against him because Kathy refused to accept help. On 2 occasions, we heard that the police had been called to their house because the neighbors could hear them arguing and getting physically violent. Despite everything, Kathy never gave in and seemed convinced that he was the right one for her. 4 years ago, I got pregnant with Tom, and everyone was happy. For my baby shower, I wanted Kathy to be part of the celebration, so we sent her an invitation. We never got a response from her, which worried us. David decided to drive to her house to check on her. It turns out that James had completely cut off her communication with us and had thrown away our invitation so she wouldn't even know about it. I don't know exactly what happened, but David, understandably, got angry, and he and James exchanged some heated words that led nowhere because Kathy didn't feel that what her husband had been doing was wrong in any way. Frustrated, David left, and that was the last time we heard from her. We never reached out to her again, not even when Tom was born. Her parents also stopped trying to convince her, and we all just prayed that she was okay. These past few years after Tom's birth have been completely peaceful and filled with love. David and I never had any major issues, and we have now reached a wonderful understanding and rhythm in our marriage. Tom is a very curious child, keeping us busy with his antics. David's parents visit us every weekend so they can watch Tom for a few hours while David and I have our weekly date night. This gives us some free time while the grandparents spend quality time with Tom. Everything seemed fine until 8 months ago when Kathy showed up at our door, all muddy and disheveled. Her feet were dirty and she had no shoes on. We immediately let her in, and I ran to get her a blanket since she seemed to be shivering. We hadn't seen her in years, so we didn't know what to say. David kept stroking her hair and asking if she was okay. She seemed numb and wasn't looking at anything in particular. Finally, she revealed to us that she had just had a miscarriage. We sat in shock as she continued to tell us how she had gotten pregnant a month ago and thought James would be happy about it. At first he was, but as the weeks passed, he became increasingly suspicious that this baby would take her away from him and that she wouldn't love him the same way anymore. They argued a lot, and he threatened to mix rat poison into her food so she would lose the baby. Kathy told us that she woke up that day feeling unwell, and when she went to the doctor, she found out that she had lost the baby. She felt so sick and numb that she couldn't get into her car and drive back home, so she decided to just walk. Somehow her brain led her to our house, but I guess she must have walked at least 20 blocks or more barefoot. She didn't remember why she didn't have shoes. I felt incredibly sorry for her and immediately hugged her. It took her a moment to register the hug, but when she did, she hugged me back. We sat there for a full 5 minutes while Kathy slowly cried in my arms. We knew at that moment that this was her way of asking for help. David seemed ready to confront James directly, but I convinced him to call the police and notify his parents, who would be better equipped to handle the situation. His parents were incredibly grateful to have their daughter back and assured her that they would support her no matter what. When the police took her statement, they were just as shocked as we were by the multiple abuses Kathy had endured in her marriage up to that point while keeping silent. James was immediately arrested despite his protests and threats. He kept denying everything until the end, claiming that he had nothing to do with her miscarriage. However, according to Kathy's report, she had indeed been poisoned by him, leading to the loss of her baby. In short, due to James's mental health issues and his incompetence to stand trial, the judge sent him to a psychiatric facility for treatment indefinitely. This decision was obviously frustrating, but we were also grateful to have Kathy back safe and sound. I must clarify that all my previous feelings of animosity toward her had disappeared at this point. As a woman, I felt bad for her and wanted nothing more than to forget our past so we could move forward. I wanted nothing more than for Kathy to heal after this terrible experience. She also seemed at peace around me and was no longer mean to me. When we felt she was ready, we introduced her to Tom as we thought this would help her recover faster. She became very close to Tom in no time, which we didn't mind. I guess that should have been my first red flag. As the weeks passed, she found ways to spend more time with my son, showing up unexpectedly at our house without calling first. She was living with David's parents, so she could easily drive to our house. She insisted on bathing Tom or reading him bedtime stories, which at first seemed like a kind gesture. However, her growing presence started to feel a little strange. It got to the point where Kathy was coming over almost every day unannounced, always finding a reason to stay longer than necessary. She brought toys and gifts for Tom, always looking to be involved in his daily routines. She also made strange comments about his clothes or hairstyle, telling me how Tom would look better in this or that way, which annoyed me a little. Although I appreciated her efforts to bond with him, it started to feel like she was going back to her old ways of belittling me. However, this time, instead of her brother, it was about my son, and my maternal instincts kicked in. I spoke with David, who assured me that I was probably overthinking and that his sister was just trying to cope with her pain. He reminded me that she had just lost her child, which made me feel guilty, so I decided to let it go. If taking care of my son made her happy for a few minutes, what harm could it do, right? As the days passed, I tried to be as understanding as possible about her constant presence in our home. She started looking after Tom every day while we were at work, and even took him to the park to play in the afternoon. Sometimes when I got home, I noticed that my son no longer showed the same excitement to see me as he always had. He no longer ran to greet me and instead looked at me curiously. After Kathy left, I tried to talk to Tom about his day and if he had any problems with Kathy being around, but he didn't engage much in the conversation. My son, who was always cheerful around me, seemed sad and less enthusiastic. As a mother, I was deeply worried about the change in my son's behavior, but every time I tried to talk to my husband about it, he gently told me I was overthinking trivial matters. David tried to assure me that it was all in my head and that Tom was just growing up. However, the persistent feeling in my mind kept bothering me, so I talked to one of my coworkers about it, and she gave me the brilliant idea of buying surveillance cameras from Amazon and installing them in my son's room and the living room to keep an eye on Tom. This was a clever idea, and I immediately bought 2 cameras. I never told David about it because I didn't want him to dismiss my feelings once again. Yesterday, I got home, and after Tom went to bed, I decided to review the surveillance footage I had set up. David was watching TV downstairs, so I sat in my study to watch the video, which also had audio. At first, I only saw Kathy looking after Tom and playing with him. She seemed really good with kids. However, imagine my surprise when I saw Kathy pull a book out of her bag. something I hadn't noticed before. Normally, we have age-appropriate books for our son in his room, but this book was different. She read the book to Tom before his afternoon nap. As I listened to the story, I realized it was about adoption and how sometimes a mother gives her child to another mother to take care of them. As Kathy read the story to my son, she added that this was why she had left Tom in my care all these years, because she wasn't ready. Then, my eyes widened in horror as she continued telling my son that she would always be his real mother and that no one could love him more than she did. She kissed his forehead and let him sleep. My hands trembled with rage as I finally understood the nonsense she had been feeding my son for who knows how long, which had clearly caused him to act strangely around me. This poor child must have been terribly confused and simply didn't know what to believe. I was ready to run downstairs and tell my husband that his sister would never set foot in our house again, but something stopped me. Instead, I decided to take the day off to spend time alone with my son and find out exactly what Kathy had been telling him to brainwash him. When I told Kathy that she didn't need to come to babysit, she became hysterical, insisting that she loved spending time with my son. I firmly told her to step aside and that I wanted the day with my son. David asked if I was feeling okay, and I assured him that everything was fine, but that I just needed a break. Later, I took my son to his favorite park to play all day. We ate pizza and spent the whole day laughing and having fun before I brought up the topic. I wanted my son to feel safe around me. When I started asking him about what he and his aunt had been talking about, he got a little quiet. I promised Tom that he wasn't in trouble in any way, and that I just wanted him to know he could talk to me about anything. And that's when my son revealed the truth. He told me how Kathy had been trying to convince him for weeks that she was his real mother. Although he didn't really believe it, she also told him how eventually I would leave him because only real mothers love their children. Because of her insistence, he felt scared to ask me about it in case I would really abandon him. He told me he loved me and didn't want to go live with Kathy. Hearing those words broke my heart. As I looked at his tear-filled face, he looked so small and vulnerable, in stark contrast to the cheerful and playful child I knew so well. I knelt down to his level, gently took his hands in mine, and assured him that everything was going to be okay. We would get through this together, no matter what. I hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of his fears and pain. I felt like a failure for not having protected my son from this madness. I assured him that he had nothing to worry about and that David and I would handle this. However, then my son informed me that David already knew about all of this. I asked him what he meant by that, and he responded, "I asked Dad. He knows about this, but he told me not to tell you anything." The blood drained from my face as I realized that my husband, despite discovering what his sister was doing, had chosen to protect her instead of our son. He already knew everything. I couldn't allow my son to be around these people. I didn't want my son to be confused and scared about his own mother. I am his mother, and it was my duty to protect him from this. Quickly, I drove home and packed our bags. I told my parents I was going to their house, and that if David asked, we would tell him that I missed them and wanted to spend some time with them. Fortunately, my parents are very understanding, so they didn't hesitate to say yes. As I write this, I have already spoken to my parents about everything, and they are just as shocked as I am about what Kathy has been telling my son. David called me when he must have come home to an empty house, but I tried to sound as normal as possible, telling him I needed a break from our home and my work. He sounded curious, but I assured him that I would be staying with my parents for just a few days. We rarely argue, so I guess he didn't think much of it, although my behavior must have seemed strange to him. I am so confused right now. I have no idea what I should do. How should I handle this situation? Update 1. Wow. I woke up to almost 600 comments on my post. I can't believe so many people use Reddit and found my story. I have used fake names in my account, so I hope none of David's relatives find out that this is about him. Also, for those criticizing me in the comments for not talking to my husband first, I assure you that I definitely would have spoken to him if my son hadn't told me that he tried talking to David when he first found out. Call it motherly instinct, but the fact that my husband knew for weeks how my son had been behaving differently toward me, yet kept making me believe it was just my imagination, shows that a confrontation with him wouldn't have led to anything constructive. I also wanted to get my son out of that situation immediately, and now he is much safer with my parents. Here, no psychopath can feed him lies, and that is the only thing that matters. Kathy has tried to contact me several times, sending me multiple messages insisting that she needs to see my son and how much she misses him. I plan to put an end to this once and for all at the upcoming family gathering at David's parents' house this weekend. This gathering has been planned for weeks on my part since David's grandparents are visiting, and I thought we could spend some quality time together. However, in light of recent events, I plan to use this opportunity to tell my truth and ensure that Kathy never gets near my son again. Update 2. Here I am again with an update. I finally confronted David and Kathy as planned during the family gathering. I was very nervous before going, but I decided to bring the nanny cam recording with me as legitimate proof to show everyone. Without going into too much detail and getting straight to the point, I called Kathy out in front of everyone during lunch. She looked flustered and tried to downplay it as if it wasn't a big deal. Then I showed the nanny cam recording and told her how I had recorded what she had been saying to my son. I watched as the color drained from her face while I sent the video to the family group chat so everyone could see what I was talking about. Her parents were horrified to see her trying to convince my son that she was his real mother. After this, I confronted David and told him how he had failed to protect our son. My husband looked genuinely guilty, but tried to justify it by saying he didn't think much of it and thought this would help his sister get through her grief. He felt torn between supporting his sister's recovery and telling me, but in the end, he chose to stay silent. I told him that because of his actions, I no longer trusted him and couldn't let my son be around him or his family ever again. For the first time in a long time, I saw my husband break down in tears, but I didn't back down from my decision. I told him I couldn't allow my son to grow up in a family where his father refused to stand up for him just to protect his mentally unstable sister. David and Kathy's parents and grandparents apologized to me and assured me that they would make sure Kathy never got near our son again. Kathy looked completely humiliated, but didn't even have the decency to apologize once. David kept justifying his actions, but I ignored him. I left shortly after this confrontation because my job there was done, and I no longer wanted to have anything to do with any of them. Update 3. I see that some of you are confused by my decision, so I wanted to clarify, yes, I plan to divorce my husband. I know many of you wanted me to give him a second chance since this wasn't entirely his fault, and I agree that David is a good man. However, being a good man doesn't automatically make him a good father. The fact that he and I never had problems doesn't mean he was a good father to Tom. He should have shut this down from the very beginning when our son came to him with doubts, instead of spending weeks trying to cover it up and manipulate me. Both my son and I can no longer trust him. I welcomed Kathy back into my life with open arms after what happened because, as a woman, I felt sorry for her. But in the end, she proved exactly why I never liked her in the first place. I understand that the abuse Kathy suffered was extremely traumatic for her, but that doesn't mean our son should have to pay for it. She was an adult woman who clearly had mental issues from the start, but we thought she had improved. However, what truly shocked me was my husband. The fact that he chose her mental well-being over our son's shows why he should never be around Tom. He was always such a supportive husband that I thought I could trust him, but ever since this happened with Kathy, it's clear he wanted to protect her more than us. I promise that from now on, I will protect my son no matter what. I am sure I can get full custody of my son if I expose his family's history during the custody battle. Update 4. Since some time has passed and my divorce is finalized, I decided it was a good time for an update. First of all, I have already divorced David and gained full custody because the judge saw that he was not a good father to Tom. What he did was wrong on many levels and was questionable from any perspective, because condoning his sister's behavior with our child was deeply disturbing. He will be able to see him, but only under supervision, as he cannot be alone with him. As for his sister, their parents tried to reason with her again because they didn't want to institutionalize her again, but unfortunately that wasn't possible since she clearly needed professional help. It must be horrible as a parent to go through something like this, and I understand that they didn't want to go through it a second time, but I guess it's for the best for everyone. So that's all for now. With my ex-sister-in-law in treatment and my ex-husband without custody, I can now focus on taking care of my son and moving on with my life peacefully.